The first 5 chapters of Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics can seem like an abrupt shift from the immediately preceding discussion of the particular virtues of character. Here, Aristotle switches to a different topic, the nature of voluntary action, of the processes of decision, deliberation, and wish, and to our responsibility for our character. Scholars have often puzzled over Aristotle's apparent interruption in the flow of his explication of the particular virtues. However, there is a way to view chapters 1 through 5 of Book 3 as a natural continuation from the previous discussion rather than as a digression. The previous emphasis on habituation as the source of virtue may suggest that a person is not responsible for their virtuous actions. They just got lucky, or they were lucky enough to be well brought up. However, virtuous actions are fit to be praised, and vicious ones are fit to be condemned. And we are not praised or condemned for things that we're not responsible for. Moreover, statesmen encourage virtuous action and discourage vicious action, and they do so by applying rewards and punishments. And unless people are responsible for their actions, this would be unjust. Hence, we need to examine more closely what the conditions of responsible action are. Now, voluntary action is the basic necessary condition for moral responsibility of any sort. If an action is involuntary, one cannot be responsible for it. However, depending on how voluntary action is conceived, it may not be sufficient, or at least it may not be sufficient for the kind of responsibility that humans have for their virtuous and vicious actions. We also need to ask, what are the conditions that must be satisfied in order for a person to be responsible for his virtuous or vicious action? That's the real question. What are the conditions that must be satisfied in order for a person to be responsible for his or her virtuous or vicious action? It is at this point that Aristotle turns inward in his examination to investigate the details of what's going on in the head of the person who is performing an ethical action. This is what's known in philosophy as moral psychology. That is, study of the processes of the mind that are involved in the exercise of moral reasoning and choice. That's what we mean by moral psychology. Philosophical examination of the processes of the mind that are involved in the exercise of moral reasoning and choice. For Aristotle, we've already seen that the exercise of moral discernment and judgment is an essential, indeed a definitional, component of what makes an action virtuous. One needs to hit the intermediate or the mean in order to be virtuous. And this involves the exercise of a distinctive mental capacity, which is itself a virtue of thought, namely prudence. But Aristotle hasn't yet gone into the precise manner in which prudence is exercised. It remains a bit of a black box at this point. To be sure, we shouldn't expect too much detail in his account, as his doctrine of the inexactitude of ethics ensures that there's never going to be some kind of an algorithm for prudence. However, Aristotle is now going to explore in a little more detail, what we might describe as structural detail, the inner workings of the psychology of moral decision-making for the purpose of uncovering the conditions that make a virtuous action virtuous, and also, in doing so, being able to understand the conditions of moral responsibility, which is ultimately what he's looking for in these first 5 chapters of Book 3. In Aristotle's theory, there is an interlocking of the 3 psychological processes of decision, deliberation, and wishing. decision, deliberation, and wishing. The internal character of this process is responsible for making an action a virtuous or vicious action. The wishes, we might say the very wishes and deliberations of the virtuous person are going to characteristically differ from those of the vicious person. This may or may not lead to the same type of decisions in one sense. So we put same in air quotes here, the same decisions. That is, in the sense that the outward actions may be indistinguishable. For example, the truly generous man and the merely reputation-seeking man may both give an equal amount to the city's poor. But inwardly, the decisions will have a different character because they originated through a different process of deliberation and wish. That's what Aristotle is going to want to lay out for us, that view. Second, which actions one can be held responsible for will be determined by the identification of those actions. The identification of those actions, which in turn will depend upon what the person thought they were doing. And here is where an understanding of what the person was aiming at and how they deliberated about how to get it will be crucial. So these are the four subtopics that combine in Aristotle's account of moral responsibility. There's voluntary action in general, is the first, then decision, then deliberation, and then wish. There appears to be a kind of regressive structure to Aristotle's argument, or a regress on the conditions, as philosophers call it. That is, in the examination of voluntary action, it turns out that decision is a condition of the type of voluntary action that entails moral responsibility. Because for Aristotle, there is a type of voluntary action in the case of animals, but of course animals aren't morally responsible. So the scope of voluntary action is wider than that of decision. Decision is going to isolate that type of voluntary action that entails moral responsibility. But in the examination of decision, it turns out that deliberation, being the outcome of a process of deliberation, is a condition of true decision. And in the Greek, there's actually more of a linguistic connection between those two concepts of decision and deliberation. So we start out by asking, what type of voluntary action makes someone morally responsible? This leads us to conclude that it's voluntary action that involves a decision that is the truly morally responsible one. But when we ask, well, what goes into it, making a decision? What is a decision? It's going to turn out in Aristotle's account by what he means by decision, maybe not what we always mean when we use the English word. That's an important point to make. We're dealing here, of course, with Aristotle's somewhat technical account. But in his account of decision, it always is going to involve a deliberation. And in deliberation, it turns out that a wish is required. That wish is a condition of true deliberation. All deliberation is going to be anchored in a wish. So this is what I was describing as a regress on the conditions. We start by inquiring into voluntary action, and we ask what the conditions are of voluntary action that's morally responsible, voluntary action. That leads us to go back to the condition of decision. When we ask what makes decision possible as a source of moral responsibility, that leads us to the idea that deliberation must precede the decision in order for it to be a morally responsible decision. And when we ask, well, what makes deliberation possible, we discover that deliberation always depends, or is in, as I'm describing it, anchored in, which isn't, I don't think Aristotle's way of putting it, but it's always dependent upon a wish. So this is a kind of picture of the argumentative structure that's going on here in these first four chapters. So the first topic is that of voluntary action. And the Greek here is hekon, which can be translated as of its own accord. As always, I invite you to get more details about this, the nuances of the Greek from the glossary of our edition. Of its own accord. Voluntary, this is rooted in the Latin word for the will, volition. And so we shouldn't assume the whole apparatus of a kind of post-Augustinian conception of the will, post-Christian, a Christian conception of the will. I'll return to that point at the end of the video here. This just means of its own accord. So Aristotle is interested in discovering the conditions that an action must satisfy in order to be voluntary. And the way he proceeds is indirect, by examining those cases that we all would agree are involuntary. From this, we can glean some insight into what the conditions of voluntariness would be. So there are two main ways in which voluntary action can be interfered with, i.e. made less voluntary, or made fully involuntary. And these are force and ignorance. Force and ignorance. So the involuntary is going to be rooted in one of these two sources, force or ignorance. So first, force. Section 3, page 35 here in our text. He says, what is forced has an external principle, the sort of principle in which the agent, or rather the victim, contributes nothing. If, for instance, a wind or people who have him in their control were to carry him off. So here, an initiation of change, in the case of force, an initiation of change is caused by something external to the person himself or herself. But there's a spectrum here. There's a clear-cut case in which a person contributes nothing, like Aristotle's example, a strong wind blows one sailor into another, knocking him overboard. The sailor who is blown by the wind isn't responsible. But Aristotle recognizes a question here about borderline cases. So to stick with the maritime example, in a storm at sea, the captain has to make a decision to throw the cargo overboard. You can see Aristotle's description of this in sections 4 and 5. And the person might say, the captain might say, justifying it to, let's say, the owners of the ship or his merchants, I was forced to throw the cargo overboard. I'm not responsible. I didn't do it voluntarily. So there are many cases like this in which people will plead that they were forced to do something. Aristotle considers these to be mixed actions, neither fully voluntary nor fully involuntary. And he thinks he's reflecting, common opinion here. They're not really cases of involuntary action, but rather of reluctant voluntary action due to lack of any really good choices. And when we examine these cases, what we see, the reason that they're not pure cases is that unlike the case of a strong wind blowing you, if you throw the cargo overboard because you want to save the ship or save the crew, your principle is still clearly within you. Clearly, there was something in you that could have gone the other way. And so it's not a truly involuntary case. But what this does suggest is that an action is voluntary only if the principle of the action is an internal one. And an action is involuntary only if the principle is wholly outside the person. So from force, we get a particular condition of voluntary action, we might say. namely voluntary action. Put it this way. An action is voluntary only if its principle, which is just a kind of generic word for what it's based on, only if its principle is an internal one. By which you mean it's in the person performing the action, or as philosophers sometimes say, within the agent. So this is our first condition of voluntary action. An action is voluntary only if the principle of the action is an internal one. However, this is not the only condition. A second condition can be gleaned from the cases of involuntary action that result from ignorance. Aristotle observes that the ignorance in question must be ignorance, he says, of the particular, not of the universal. Of the particular, ignorance of the particular, not ignorance of the universal. So what does this mean? Well, take the ignorance of the universal first. To be ignorant of the universal means to be ignorant of general facts about what is right and wrong. This never absolves a person from responsibility for Aristotle. Indeed, it's precisely this sort of ignorance, he thinks, that's characteristic of vicious people. You can see that in section 15. Note that this ignorance is distinct from a mental defect that renders a person incapable of recognizing wrong acts as wrong. So Aristotle is talking here about something like a coarse or callous person, not a deranged person. There still might be problems with that, but anyway, that's the point is that someone who would be ignorant of the fact that murder is wrong, or stealing is wrong, to take a more neutral example, such a person wouldn't be absolved from responsibility for stealing. That would be the kind of person who utterly lacked any kind of virtuous character. The particulars that would absolve someone of responsibility are when someone is ignorant of those details that the prudent person would be attentive to. So here we get another one of these lists, like I cited in the last video, in section 15 and 16. He says, rather, the cause is ignorance of the particulars which the action consists in and is concerned with, since these allow both pity and pardon. For an agent acts involuntarily if he is ignorant of one of these particulars. Presumably, then, it is not a bad idea to define these particulars and say what they are and how many. They are who is doing it, what he is doing, about what or to what he is doing it. Sometimes also what he is doing it with what instrument, for example. For what result, safety, for example. In what way, gently or hard, for example. These, remember, were also the particulars that the prudent person must be concerned with when they're concerned with finding the intermediate in respect of all these particulars. So the ignorance of the particulars maybe we best illustrated through paradigm examples. The paradigm case of such ignorance in modern pop culture might be the ignorance that leads to fights between superheroes in the comic books. Right? I thought you were a supervillain. That's why I, committed an aggressive action towards you. So that's a kind of ignorance of the particulars, not knowing who you're doing this action to. You think you're doing it to a supervillain when actually you're doing it to a superhero. Or let's say I feed you something that you're allergic to, killing you, but I did it out of ignorance. Unlike clear-cut cases of force, Aristotle remarks that acting from ignorance typically will cause regret. He also draws a distinction on this basis between unwilling and non-willing action, which, for the sake of time, I think we can safely skip over here. So, from the cases in which ignorance renders an action involuntary, we can derive another kind of condition of voluntary action, namely that an action is voluntary only if the person knows the particulars of the action. We can call this the agent. Only if the agent knows the particulars of the action. All right, so these are the conditions, but notice these are framed as necessary conditions, not as sufficient conditions. So on its own, this is not necessarily a description of morally responsible action. It's not a complete description. In section 20 on page 38, Aristotle summarizes these when he says, voluntary action seems to be what has its principle in the agent himself, knowing the particulars that constitute the action. So that's voluntary action. What has its principle in the agent itself, and the agent knows the particulars that constitute the action. So this leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle that the voluntariness of an action can be nullified by force and ignorance? Are these factors sufficient to absolve someone of moral responsibility? How would you explain why people sometimes feel morally responsible for actions they were forced to do or did in a state of ignorance? So this is the first discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle that the voluntariness of an action can be nullified by force and ignorance? Are these factors sufficient to absolve someone of moral responsibility? How would you explain why people sometimes feel morally responsible for actions that they were forced to do or did in a state of ignorance? And I've just sort of sketched out all of the issues that are involved surrounding force and ignorance and the way in which they relate to moral responsibility. So it's certainly worth discussing, even in terms of other things Aristotle says about these that I've glossed over here. So this brings us to the topic of decision. So far, we have the notion that a voluntary action involves the initiation of a change in the world for the sake of some aim, which is neither the result of force nor of ignorance. This implies that the person must have the principle of the action in himself and be aware of the relevant particulars of an action. However, as I suggested, this notion of voluntariness by itself is insufficient to provide a full account of what in an action makes a person morally responsible. It merely tells us the negative condition of moral responsibility, what would absolve us from it. It doesn't give us yet any insight into the positive source of moral responsibility. For all we know at this point, animals are just as responsible for their actions as humans, since they often perform at least actions analogous to the ones that Aristotle describes as voluntary. And obviously, this is not Aristotle's position. He observes, chapter 2, section 2, page 39, decision then is apparently voluntary, but not the same as the voluntary which extends more widely. For children and the other animals share in voluntary action, but not in decision. And the actions we do on the spur of the moment are said to be voluntary, but not in accord with decision. The added factor that humans have and animals do not then is what he calls decision. And the Greek word here is proheresis, which you might translate better as deliberate decision. You sometimes see it translated this way, also as choice. But deliberate decision, it contains the decision in the definition, deliberation, or deliberate, the reference to deliberation, which is part of the Greek word, contains this reference to deliberate decision as opposed to just decision. And I think certainly in common English usage, we do have the concept of a decision that doesn't necessarily involve any deliberation. And so the word prohairesis in Greek is not necessarily going to have that same connotation. So the idea is that, well, both humans and animals engage in the initiation of changes in the world for the sake of some aim, which is neither the result of force nor ignorance. In humans, this, at least when it reflects their human character, is the result of choice or deciding to initiate the change. So decision is a particular type of voluntary action, as Aristotle said in this passage I just quoted. It's a subset of the broader set or class of voluntary actions. It involves setting deliberate purposes, namely to seek ends that are within one's power. Aristotle says at the beginning of the chapter that decision seems to be most proper to virtue and to distinguish characters from one another better than actions do. In other words, as in my example of the generous person and the reputation-seeking person who both give money, let's say to a particular charity, you can't tell the difference between those people just by looking at their outward actions. It's only by looking at their decision, what's going on in their head, so to speak, that you begin to get a sense of what they're actually deciding to do. And it's important here, I think, that, of course, we can describe the decision just in terms of giving money. But the more robust description of the decision is I decided to benefit people with my money versus, let's say, I decided to enhance my reputation by giving money to this charity. Give us a clearer picture of what actually is going on here. So it turns out that there's an internal connection between the more robust description of what the decision is that identifies the decision as the particular decision it is, and the process of deliberation that went into it. And that's going to be important for Aristotle. This connection between really identifying the decision, giving it its proper identity and its content, is going to involve a kind of reference to the deliberation that went into it. And as we'll see, also the wish that ultimately anchored the deliberations. The decisions that we make, more than anything, Aristotle seems to be saying, reflect what is distinctive of our character. In fact, they not only reflect our character, but they also build our character, because it's through performing virtuous actions, of course, that we become virtuous. And it's through performing vicious actions, likewise, that we become vicious. Much of Aristotle's account of decision is aimed towards distinguishing decision or choice from other things with which it might be and has been conflated, namely appetite, spirit, wish, and belief. Appetite, spirit, wish, and belief. So the way he argues in this chapter is to say, okay, the question is, what is decision? What do we mean by decision? What do we mean by prohairesis, which has, remember, the sense of a deliberate decision. And in order to get clear on what that is, he's going to contrast it with these other things. But why does he pick these things to contrast it with? Well, evidently because there is some degree of commonality, some point of intersection between decision and these other things that could potentially, create confusion. He didn't seem to actually be worried about confusion, but rather by examining why and how decision is different from these other things, we can isolate the essence of decision more clearly. By contrasting it with things that it is not, we come to see what it is. So it's a similar procedure to actually what he did in isolating the notion of voluntary action. He proceeded by contrasting it with involuntary action. What contrasts voluntary action from involuntary action? That way we get a clear idea of voluntary action. Same sort of procedure here. We're going to contrast it with these other things. And in this way, maybe we can get a clear idea as to what it is. So first, he considers these first two, appetite and spirit. And appetite and spirit are shared with the animals. Appetite is a kind of desire, but here, especially the desires that you're feeling in a bodily way right now. So it's a distinction, there's a distinction between feeling something bodily as a bodily lack or even as a pain, and calling that a desire, or just having kind of an abstract desire. So, the contrast is between, let's say, the way in which in the Beatles' Revolution, John Lennon says, we'd all love to save the world. That's describing kind of abstract desire that you would describe as an appetite. But most of us would probably say, would you like world peace? Yeah, in a sense you desire it, right? But it's not, an appetite would be this, what you're feeling in a bodily way right now. And that's why, in the Beatitude where Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's the contrast between John Lennon and Jesus, even though John Lennon sometimes got confused as to who is who. But the contrast here would be between this kind of like passive, we'd all love to save the world, right? Versus someone who hungers and thirsts, who feels it almost as a bodily pain that they want to see justice in the world and so on. So that's the idea of appetite. And certainly the animals share those. Spirit is also a very bodily thing. It's what's responsible for the competitive drive, but it's a more bodily driving force, a drive in maybe the psychoanalytical sense of a drive. It's more of a drive than a kind of idea or just a goal that you would set for yourself, like in a business setting or something. It's related to aggression and anger. Spirit. I had a classmate in high school, memorably was known for his spirit in this sense. Got frustrated on the basketball court and put his fists through those wire mesh windows that they used to have, which I'm sure precisely for this reason they no longer have in high schools, and ended up tearing up his arm, whatever. That was a result of spirit, right? That kind of competitive drive that just leads to a kind of overwhelming, a kind of anger or aggression and so forth. And clearly both of these, the animals have appetite and spirit. One might question whether or not the animals make decisions or make choices. And it's most plausible to say they don't make deliberate choices. They don't make deliberate decisions. And so here the tight logical connection between proeresis and deliberation matters when Aristotle will say that animals possess appetite and spirit, but they don't possess the capacity for decision. That might not be plausible in all senses of the English word decision, but it certainly is plausible in the sense of deliberate decision. We could say that, my cat decided to take a nap instead of go outside, but I seriously doubt that he sits around deliberating about which one of these he should do. He just does whatever his impulse at the time tells him to do. And that is characteristic of appetite and of spirit. They're impulsive. Probably you don't require a lot of convincing to accept that a decision is different from a wish. But for Aristotle, the point, again, is not so much, I think, to make the point that decision is different from wish, but to examine how they're similar and how they're different. For Aristotle, decisions are limited to things we can accomplish through our power, but wishes extend beyond that. So we see in sections 7 and 8, but further, it is not wish either, although it is apparently close to it. For we do not decide on impossible things, and anyone who claimed to decide on them would seem a fool. But we do wish for impossible things, for immortality, for instance, as well as possible things. That is, it makes sense, and it's not foolish at all for someone to say, gosh, I wish I could live, maybe not immortal, but maybe I wish I could live another 500 years. That's a wish many people, maybe the majority of people have. But to say, I'm going to decide to live 500 years, that would be regarded as a kind of delusion or maybe megalomania in someone who, let's say, was a scientific researcher who was going to discover a cure for aging and death. Even in them, it would seem to be, a bit arrogant and extravagant to say you were going to decide on that, right? So that shows that wishing is different from decision in the sense that decision has to do with things that are in our power. Further, we wish not only for results we can achieve, but also for results that are possible but not achievable through our own agency. Victory for some actor or athlete, for instance. But what we decide on is never anything of that sort, but what we think would come about through our own agency. So wish, the contrast with wish points out that decision always has to do with things that are within our own agency. We decide for things that are within our own power. As for belief, the essential difference is that the standard of belief is truth and falsity, whereas the standard of decision is good and bad. In other words, our beliefs are assessed as to whether they're true or false beliefs, whereas our decisions are not assessed as true or false decisions, but rather as good or bad decisions. Also, there's no essential connection between what one believes about good and evil and one's character. But there is an essential distinct connection between what one decides regarding good and evil and one's character. So the fact that decision is conceptually close to appetite, spirit, wish, and belief, yet distinct from them, leads Aristotle to try to carve out a distinctive niche for it. Like appetite and spirit, it seems attuned to achieving ends, to the actual achievement of ends, but seems to have some more intellectual component than appetite and spirit. Appetite and spirit are more sensuous, bodily, compulsive, whereas decision involves a more intellectual component than these. Just go like that. So that's what we learn about decision by contrasting with appetite and spirit. Then if we contrast it with wish, we could say like wish, it's directed towards the future. We always decide about the future, just like we always wish about the future. We don't decide about things in the past. But it seems more practical. That is, it's not just a matter of engaging our imagination or our fancy, fantasizing about things, but actually it's about doing something about the future. And then, like belief, it seems to be a process of reasoning of some sort. Just as we reason to our beliefs, we reason to decision, but it's aimed at the good rather than at truth. So again, we could say it's more practical. So these are the conclusions that he arrives at about the nature of decision or deliberate decision, proeresis. All of these reflections, combined with etymological considerations that I mentioned, seem to combine to lead Aristotle to his conclusion, which is in section 16 and 17 on page 40. Then what sort of thing is decision, since it is none of the things mentioned? Well, apparently it is voluntary, but not everything voluntary is decided. Then perhaps what is decided is what has been previously deliberated. For decision involves reason and thought, and even the name itself would seem to indicate that what is decided is chosen before other things. What is decided is chosen before other things. So, we are then referred from the discussion of decision to the discussion of deliberation, which in Greek is boloisis. And this is derived from a word for counsel. So it means something like counseling oneself. Deliberation is counseling yourself, counseling oneself, giving yourself advice. Like decision, deliberations are concerned with things that are within one's power to accomplish. So he says there, section 7, page 41, we deliberate about what is up to us, that is to say, about the actions we can do. And this is the remaining possibility. For causes seem to include nature, necessity, and fortune, but besides them, mind and everything operating through human agency. But we do not deliberate about all human affairs. No Spartan, for instance, deliberates about how the Scythians might have the best political system. Rather, each group of human beings deliberates about the actions that they themselves can do. So it concerns things that are within one's power to accomplish. Also, deliberation is always about things that one is in doubt about, when the outcome is unclear and when the right way to act is undefined. So, about things within one's power. Is the first one, and then the second one about things that one is in doubt about. So the idea here is that we can act voluntarily in ways that are just kind of everyday habitual ways that we don't have to deliberate about. So I don't have to deliberate about how to, brush my teeth or, wash laundry or things like this. Things that I've done many times before and that are automatic, very familiar procedures aren't the object of deliberation. Objects of deliberation are things that one is in doubt about in some sense, when the outcome in the future is hazy and the right way, the right course of action is undefined. So he says, there is no deliberation about the sciences that are exact and self-sufficient, as, for instance, about letters, since we are in no doubt about how to write them in spelling a word. I don't have to deliberate about how should I write the word, deliberation. I've written that word many times. I know how to write it. I don't have to deliberate about how to write the word deliberation. Rather, we deliberate about what comes about through our agency, but comes about in different ways on different occasions. About, for instance, medicine and money making. Right? So how should I make money? How should I treat this patient? These are inherently things that we need to deliberate about because the answer is going to depend on the context, always. There is no one answer to the question, how should I make money? It depends. How should I make money on the stock market? Well, what's the situation in the stock market now or at the time you're talking about? Similarly, how should I treat this patient? Well, it depends on, how's the patient doing? What kind of illnesses or symptoms does this patient have, and so forth. So that's where deliberation comes in, when there's some kind of uncertainty. So we're dealing about things one is in doubt about or are in some way undefined. Like, define stock market. What stock market are we talking about? Define patient. Which patient are we talking about? Those are the cases in which we deliberate. Okay, so according to Aristotle, we deliberate also about the means to an end, not the end itself. So we deliberate about the means to an end, not the end itself. Section 11, he says, we deliberate not about ends, but about means to ends. A doctor, for instance, does not deliberate about whether to cure, or an orator about whether to persuade, or a politician about whether to produce good order, or any other expert about the end that the science aims at. Rather, we lay down the end and then examine the ways and means to achieve it. So we deliberate about the means to an end, not the end itself. And this naturally raises a question for us. Can one not deliberate about whether to become a doctor in the first place, or an orator, or a politician? And certainly we want to say it seems so. It might be seen as puzzling that Aristotle holds that we can't deliberate about ends. After all, isn't this something that we do all the time? For example, when deciding whether to seek the end of wealth or the end of honor. And of course you want to say, yes, of course it is. Hence, Aristotle shouldn't be taken as making a statement about a supposed inability to set ends for ourselves, as if we have to just take these as given. But rather, he's making a point about his notion of deliberation itself. He's making the point that this is simply the thought process that takes ends for granted and thinks about the steps to achieving those ends. Presumably, what's taken for granted at one level could become a means that is deliberated about at another level. How will I make more money as an orator or as a doctor? We could certainly deliberate about those at a different level. But of course, if we occupy the position of a doctor, there's no question about, for example, whether I should adopt the ends of a doctor, the ends that are characteristic of that profession once I've chosen it. Because deliberation is only ever about the means to an end and never about what the ends should be, it always presupposes ends as given. But what counts as an end and what counts as a means will be context dependent. Nevertheless, it's clear that there will be some ends that are not deliberated about, but that are simply accepted as ends without any deliberation. These will presumably include the basic goods that Aristotle has previously discussed, happiness and the means to it. These ends that are things, he says, that appear not only the easiest to achieve, but also that appear fine to us. As he says in the bottom of section 11, in section 11, the bottom of 41. For this reason, deliberation has to get its ends from somewhere in order to operate. Having a source of ends is the condition of the possibility of deliberation. Otherwise, there would be nothing to deliberate about, and it would be empty and without content. Aristotle's view seems to be that ends, such as these basic goods, are not deliberated about, but are set out for us from another source. So that's deliberation, a kind of counseling oneself that seeks to arrive at a course of action concerning matters that are uncertain or indeterminate in some way, where a particular end is taken as fixed or for granted as the goal of the action, and what is deliberated about are the means to achieving that end. This brings us to chapter 4, brief chapter with a brief discussion of wish. Wish plays the crucial role in Aristotle's moral psychology of being the source of ends. Wish is the source of ends. We wish for ends. Now, wish is always for an apparent good, but this may not be a good in fact. So there's this distinction between apparent goods and real goods. And wishing is always for something that appears good, but may or may not be actually good. These are really the crucial points that Aristotle wants to make in his brief chapter on wish, that it's the source of the ends that deliberation deliberates about and decision decides about when it's deciding an action. the means to the end, rather, is decided about. These ends are always something that appears good to the person who's wishing for it, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily is good. It may or may not be actually good. So what marks out the distinction between what's apparently good and what's actually good? Well, the standard here is going to be the excellent person, the virtuous person. Only the excellent person, only the virtuous person wishes for or takes pleasure in real goods. He analogizes this to how only the person with a healthy body can be relied upon to perceive things correctly. This is in section 4 there. He says, "For the excellent person, then, it is the object of wish in reality. But for the base person, it is whatever turns out to be that appears good to him. Similarly, in the case of bodies, really healthy things are healthy to people in good condition, while other things are healthy to sickly people, and the same is true of what is bitter, sweet, hot, heavy, and so on. For the excellent person judges each sort of thing correctly, and in each case what is true appears to him. For each state of character has its own distinctive view of fine and pleasant things. Presumably, then, the excellent person is far superior because he sees what is true in each case, being himself a sort of standard and measure." What's actually good versus what merely appears to be good? Well, what's actually good is what appears good to the excellent or to the virtuous person, to the person with the virtuous character. Because that person is the standard and the measure of what's actually good. The appearances to the virtuous person are what's actually good. So everyone is only going to wish for things that appear good to them, but for those people who have a bad character, they're going to wish for things that actually aren't really good. Only the people with a virtuous character are going to wish for things that are really good. This leads to the second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's propositions that 1, what appears good to you is a reflection of what you wish for, and 2, what one wishes for is a function of one's character? Why or why not? Is there a way to test whether he's right about these two propositions? How would you go about testing them if you think that's possible? So this is the second discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's propositions that 1, what appears good to you is a reflection of what you wish for, and 2, what one wishes for is a function of one's character? Why or why not? Is there a way to test whether he's right about these two propositions? How would you go about testing them if you think that's possible? This brings us to the 5th and final chapter of the first 5 chapters, which are the discussion of moral responsibility in Aristotle. The central purpose of the first 5 chapters of Book 3 is to make the case for moral responsibility, as I have been saying, and to clarify its origin, scope, and limits. Aristotle's view is that we are in some sense responsible for our moral characters, and this sense is sufficient for purposes of praise and blame and civil and criminal rewards and punishments. Earlier I said that we would see how in Aristotle's theory there is an interlocking psychological process of decision, deliberation, and wishing that together combine to make an action a genuine expression of a virtuous or vicious character. Hopefully we can see clearly now how and why the wishes and deliberations of the virtuous person are going to characteristically differ from those of the vicious person. This may or may not lead to the same types of outward actions. So decisions in one sense, if all you mean is the selection of an outward action. But inwardly, the decisions will have a different character because they originated through a different process. In addition, which actions one can be held responsible for will be determined by the identification of the actions, which in turn will depend upon what the person thought they were doing. Here's where an understanding of what the person was aiming at and whether and how they deliberated about how to get it is crucial. To some extent, you're probably already familiar with the notion that the thought processes that went into an action have a role to play in assessing moral responsibility. For example, in many jurisdictions, if you commit an unjust killing without having actually decided to kill, say by recklessly firing a weapon off in a crowded neighborhood, That's considered a lesser degree of responsibility than if you actually decided to kill someone. And if you did decide to kill, but the decision was made on the spur of the moment in the heat of passion during a drunken bar fight, for example, that's considered a lesser degree of responsibility than if it followed from the execution of a deliberate plan to kill oneself. Or to kill someone else, rather. Say, picking out a good spot to ambush them or waiting for an opportune moment. Rather chilling Freudian slip there. A deliberate plan to kill by waiting in ambush for a person. That's a higher degree of moral responsibility. And similarly, in Aristotle's theory, the interlocking psychological processes of decision, deliberation, and wishing can make it the case that the same handing over of a given quantity of money may be properly identified as an act of generosity in one case, and an act of self-promotion or reputation seeking in another case, even though they're outwardly identical. It depends on what thoughts were going through the person's mind as they engaged in the wishing, deliberation, and decision to perform the action. So the generous person wishes to benefit others with his generosity because he sees it as a fine thing to do in itself. And he deliberates about giving money as the means to this, resulting in a decision to give money, which places the principle of action in himself, making the action voluntary. By contrast, the reputation-seeking person wishes to enhance his reputation and deliberates that giving money is the means to this, resulting in a decision to give money, which places the principle of money giving in himself, again making the action voluntary. The differences in the wishing and in the means-ends connecting that's going on in the minds of these individuals between wish and action reflect differences in character. These actions, so described, seem to be actions for which the persons can be held morally responsible, such that we would all agree that the generous person is due a certain praise for their action that the reputation seeker is not, even though the actions are outwardly identical. We see from Aristotle's picture that the acts are rooted in differing characters. And this raises the question, are they responsible for their characters? And do they need to be responsible for their characters in order to be responsible for their actions? Aristotle's final conclusion is that we need to understand each person as, in some sense, responsible for their own character. Evidently, this responsibility will not be absolute, like a god, he says, but it's responsibility in a human sense. We're responsible for our characters in a human way. And here, a brief note to avoid confusion from, let's say, those of you who may have taken another course, Philosophy 101 even, where you discuss the so-called problem of free will and determinism, as it's known. Aristotle's approach to the whole question of moral responsibility is markedly different from some modern approaches you may be familiar with that are connected with this metaphysical question of free will and determinism. This metaphysical problem originated in its modern form with the rise of mechanistic models of natural causation, combined with modern forms of materialism that some philosophers thought modern science required, a worldview that became culturally influential, at least in scientific, philosophical, and other high culture circles. However, the true origin of the familiar version of the moral responsibility problem was St. Augustine and the Christian requirement of absolute unconditional human moral responsibility. If you can be damned to hell for all eternity for what you do, you damned well better be the only cause of your actions. There can be no room for excuses. Hence, you can't say, yes, I caused this action through my choice, and even though it was my own, it was ultimately caused by things outside me, upbringings, genetics, and so on. No, you are the sole cause of your actions. And to whatever extent the self is responsible for the self's actions, it's also responsible for itself. In modern parlance, this becomes something called libertarian free will. Even in secular philosophers, it remains a historically contingent legacy of Christianity. Immanuel Kant was probably the clearest and most precise about this. In the important chapter of the Critique of Pure Reason called The Antinomy of Pure Reason, Kant actually identified the kind of causality that moral responsibility requires with the kind of causality that God must possess in order to bring to a halt the infinite regress of causes in the series of natural events. This is part of the cosmological argument for God. Kant called this kind of causality that the truly moral agent must possess spontaneity, or which meant, is a technical term for Kant, it means a self-caused cause. In Aristotle's case, these three factors in the modern version of the problem of moral responsibility, mechanistic models of natural causation, materialism, and the Christian legacy of libertarian or spontaneously free will, are not posited as factors in the metaphysical context of moral choice, nor are the Calvinistic Jansenist models of predestination another modern way in which this problem can be solved. But this is more of a niche problem and more of interest in Calvinistic or Jansenist circles, which is a smaller group, not as influential, I think, as the problem that's rooted in modern mechanistic science and materialism. But Aristotle is going to reject all three of these conditions I just mentioned. Mechanistic models of natural causation, Aristotle would reject. He favors a teleological view of nature. Materialism, Aristotle would regard as an inadequate metaphysics. And the idea of a spontaneous free will that is analogous to God's freedom in creating the universe, Kant's conception, Aristotle would regard this as totally inappropriate for assessing human moral responsibility, because of course we are not gods. So how can it make sense to hold us to the standard of a divine being? Thus, it's a mistake if we're tempted to read Aristotle's discussion of moral responsibility as if he were responding to the modern post-Christian, post-mechanistic scientific revolution form of the problem, because he is pre all of these things. However, rather than being a disadvantage or a form of bad naivete, it's arguably a good form of naivete, because it allows him to confront the problem of moral responsibility as a problem that arises within moral discourse and practice itself, rather than as an externally imposed problem that's foisted onto the concerns of ethical theory from the outside by some dubious metaphysical or theological theories, whether it's classical Augustinian Christianity or modern materialism or Calvinism. The question is, what are the conditions that moral discourse and practice itself implies must be satisfied in order for a person to be morally responsible? It's only in these internal conditions, or only these internal conditions themselves, that will turn out to be absolutely necessary for the coherence of moral discourse and practice. Of course, if someone comes to accept a Christian or other worldview that requires this kind of freedom, then that's a different story. But that's not Aristotle's problem, is what I want to say. Okay, so the beginning of the chapter at issue here, chapter 5 of book 3, Aristotle gives this argument. He says, "We have found that we wish for the end and deliberate and decide on the means to it. Hence, the actions concerned with these means to the end are in accord with decision and are voluntary. The activities of the virtues are concerned with these means to the end. Hence, virtue is also up to us, and so also in the same way as vice. For when acting is up to us, so is not acting. When no is up to us, so is yes. And so if acting when it is fine is up to us, not acting when it is shameful is also up to us. And if not acting when it is fine is up to us, then acting when it is shameful is also up to us. But if doing and likewise not doing fine and shameful actions is up to us, and if, as we saw, doing or not doing them is what it is to be a good or bad person, being decent or base is up to us." So here's my reconstruction of the argument. Premise 1. Actions in accord with decision, deliberation, and wish are up to us. Premise 1. Actions in accord with decision, deliberation, and wish are up to us. Premise 2. Virtuous actions are in accord with decision, deliberation, and wish. Premise 2. Virtuous actions are in accord with decision, deliberation, and wish. Premise 3. Hence, virtuous actions are up to us. Premise 3, hence virtuous actions are up to us. Premise 4, if virtuous actions are up to us, then vicious actions must be as well, because they're equal or analogous in the relevant respect. That seems to be the idea. So premise 4, if virtuous actions are up to us, then vicious actions must be as well. Premise 5, hence vicious actions are up to us. Premise 5, hence vicious actions are up to us. Premise 6, and this is the key one, if virtuous and vicious actions are up to us, then the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. That is, the character of having a virtue or having a vice is up to us. So this is premise 6. If virtuous and vicious actions are up to us, then the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. Conclusion, the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. So that's the argument. Actions in accordance with decision, deliberation, and wish are up to us. Virtuous actions are in accord with decision, deliberation, and wish. Hence, virtuous actions are up to us. If virtuous actions are up to us, then vicious actions must be as well. Hence, vicious actions are up to us. If virtuous and vicious actions are up to us, then the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. Hence, the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. And we may take this conclusion as a way of stating that we are morally responsible, not just for our actions, but also for our character. We're morally responsible, not just for our actions, but for our character. From these considerations, Aristotle concludes that virtue and vice are truly within our power. And as it suggested, the controversial premise here is premise 6, that infers from virtue and vicious actions being up to us, that the virtues and vices themselves are up to us. One might object to this, that even if virtuous and vicious actions are up to us, that doesn't mean that being virtuous or vicious is up to us. Perhaps in the end, Aristotle simply thinks that it's practically necessary that we treat people as if we're responsible for being virtuous and vicious, because the first thing he cites in support of this view are the practices of legislators and the common sense assumptions of private citizens. And some of these are given in sections 7 and 8. For example, legislators approve corrective treatments and penalties on anyone who does vicious actions, etc. The familiar way in which we treat individuals as if they're responsible for their character and can be held liable for it. So he goes on at some length here on the bottom half of our page 44 up to the top of 45. You can look at that yourself. I won't quote that. I'll just point out that these sorts of arguments might seem to beg the question of whether legislators should have these practices and assumptions. Besides being supported by common assumptions and practices, the link between responsibility for virtuous and vicious actions and responsibility for the virtues and vices themselves seems also to be grounded in Aristotle's account of the acquisition of the virtues. Aristotle reminds us that a virtuous or vicious character does not appear out of nowhere. It appears as a result of the repeated performance of virtuous or vicious actions. So as he says in section 10, top of 45, but presumably he is the sort of person who is inattentive. Still, he himself is responsible for becoming this sort of person because he has lived carelessly. Similarly, an individual is responsible for being unjust because he has cheated, and for being intemperate because he has passed his time in drinking and the like. For each type of activity produces the corresponding sort of person. Recall that we only acquire the virtues at all in the first place by imitating. And imitating is a kind of pretending to be a virtuous person before we are. If we did not pretend, we would never acquire. But by pretending, we come to acquire. And similarly, one might say, unless we take responsibility for being virtuous or vicious, even if only as a matter of pretending that we are responsible, unless we do that, we'll lack the proper state of mind to perform virtuous actions in a truly virtuous manner. We have to act as if we're wholly responsible for being virtuous or vicious in order to do virtuous actions as the virtuous person does them, and likewise with vicious actions, although we're not trying to be vicious, presumably. Hence, the process of acquiring a virtuous character itself presupposes that we make the assumption that it's up to us to acquire that character or not. At first, this may only be a kind of pretending, but it does seem to be a necessary pretending if the character is going to get acquired. The beauty of this is that it's not a mere idle pretending, not merely a fiction or fantasy. In the end, if we persevere in this way, eventually we're no longer pretending. We actually truly become virtuous for real. Conversely, the vicious person who rejects the notion that he's responsible for his vicious or virtuous character, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and he makes himself vicious if he fails to take responsibility for himself. Of course, the vicious person might blame his parents or elders, saying, I didn't know that I was making myself vicious by performing these vicious actions. Aristotle isn't buying this excuse, however. If you look on page 45, he says, number 12, or section 12, only a totally insensible person could not know that a given type of activity is the source of the corresponding state. Hence, if someone does what he knows will make him unjust, he is willingly unjust. This sort of tough love response from Aristotle seems to assume that everyone has a natural sense of the good, such that no matter how bad their upbringing, if they're not totally insensible, as he says here, they will have some degree of knowledge that their actions are leading to a vicious state. However, on the other hand, the connection that Aristotle draws between character, wish, and what appears good to a person, remember this, that what appears good to you is going to depend upon your character, right? So character determines what you wish for, and wish determines what appears good to you. This implies that it seems that a person brought up from early youth in vicious habits will actually lack the ability to perceive the truly virtuous actions and the truly virtuous state as good. Moreover, Aristotle wants to make it the case that a person is responsible for what appears good to them, which he wants to say is entirely due to their character, which of course, that's his theory, but in turn he wants to say they're responsible for that character. And so because of this, Aristotle denies anything on the order of a natural sense of goodness. He wants to say that if you see truly good things as good, that's praiseworthy because you're responsible for forming the character in yourself that led you to see truly good things as good. And likewise, if you see things that aren't really good, if you see vicious things as good, that's because you have a bad character and you're responsible for that. So that requires, though, denying any kind of natural sense of goodness. So on the one hand, it seems like he wants to say you have to be totally insensible not to see that you're engaging in vicious habits. On the other hand, it seems like he wants to say that, well, there is no natural sense of goodness. So would you really have to be totally insensible? It seems like one might challenge Aristotle over whether one really would have to be totally insensible to not realize that they were giving themselves habits. Maybe they were just brought up with such habits from youth, which gave them a character that from the very beginning caused vicious things to appear good to them, so they never knew any better. So this leads to a third discussion question. Has Aristotle made a sufficient case for his thesis that we are responsible for our moral characters in a way that is sufficient for our practices of praise, blame, rewarding, and punishing? Does this case rest upon any unstated psychological or metaphysical presuppositions? If so, are these presuppositions objectionable in any way, in your view? Have the cultural transformations in morality, religion, and science undermined his position in any way? If so, how? If not, why not? So this is our third discussion question. Has Aristotle made a sufficient case for his thesis that we are responsible for our moral characters in a way that is sufficient for our practices of praise, blame, rewarding, and punishing? Does this case rest upon any unstated psychological or metaphysical presuppositions? If so, are these presuppositions objectionable? Have the cultural transformations in morality, religion, and science that have occurred since Aristotle's time undermined his position in any way? If so, how? And if not, why not?